University. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that all participants will be muted during the presentation. However, at the bottom right of your screen, you'll find a chat room, and we do welcome questions and comments. We may be commenting or answering questions as the presentation goes on, but at the end we'll have more time to more fully address your issues. Also, if you have any technical problems, please put them down there, and we'll try and address them as we go along. One more point before I introduce our wonderful presenter, Dr. Jonathan Balcom. I wanted to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available to you online after the presentation. So without ado, we're very happy that you could join us today for a discussion of the inner lives of animals with Dr. Jonathan Balcom. Dr. Balcom was born in England and grew up in Canada. He studied biology at York University in Toronto and at Carleton University in Ottawa. He then went on to get a PhD in ethology, which is animal behavior, from the University of Tennessee in 1991, where he studied communication in bats. Jonathan Balcom is the author of numerous scientific papers on animal behavior and ethics and 3 very popular books on animals: Pleasurable Kingdom, Animals and the Nature of Feeling Good; Second Nature, The Inner Lives of Animals; and The Exultant Arc, a pictorial tour of animal pleasure. Dr. Balcom is currently Department Chair for Animal Studies with Humane Society University here, based in Washington, D.C. For those of you who are friends with him on Facebook, you know he photographs and shares amazing observations about animals, their world, and their lives. A fan of alliteration, Jonathan lists his spare time activities as biking, baking, birding, Bach, and trying to understand his 2 cats. I am very pleased to welcome my colleague Jonathan Balcom as our first webinar presenter. I know you will enjoy his presentation. Jonathan?
Thanks, Joan, and thank you to all for coming. I must say this is the first time I've given a webinar, and it's a bit weird knowing I'm speaking to quite a lot of people and not being able to see them, but we'll stumble forward and see how we go. So thanks all for being here. As Joan mentioned my books, I thought I'd just allude to them briefly. The talk that I'm going to give today is based around the books that Joan mentioned, Second Nature, The Inner Lives of Animals, and these 2 books which are really focused on animals' capacity for pleasure. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, that's an area of animal experience that's been really neglected, particularly by science. First, though, a little bit of history. And to any feminists in the group, including myself, I apologize that science's history tends to have a predominance of white males, and this little run-through here will be no exception. You may recognize this as René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher and mathematician, whose views on animals are generally reviled by those who think that animals have rights, or at least that they deserve a better share of the world than they currently get from humans, because he argued that animals were mere automatons, and of course I'm speaking of non-human animals. They were automatons without feelings, they had no souls, and were therefore of no moral consequence. Charles Darwin came along a couple of centuries later and changed all that, because his theory of evolution by natural selection, which most scientists do not anymore view really as a theory, it's more of a sort of a law of nature. It shows that we're all connected biologically, that we all have shared roots. All animals are connected. In fact, we're even connected to plants if you go far back enough through the evolutionary tree. And then this is a 20th century American biologist, Donald Griffin. He co-discovered echolocation in bats back in 1938. Of course, the bats had discovered it many centuries earlier. So he'd already distinguished himself as a biologist. But in the 1970s, he started writing about animal minds and animals' capacity to think. And sadly, this had been a taboo. Science has had a taboo on asking questions about animals' inner capacities for most of the 20th century. So I like to think that Donald Griffin's work was sort of the beginning of a new revolution, a new era in scientific attitudes towards animals. And that's continued to this day. Today there's more questions being asked about animals and their capacities for feelings and thinking than ever before. And so I must warn you, there's a pun coming up here, but I like to say that we can be thankful for Charles Darwin and the likes of Donald Griffin for putting the horse before Descartes. So this is a very exciting time to be an ethologist, to be one who is interested in the study of animal behavior. And of course, one doesn't have to be a professional ethologist like I am to be interested in this stuff. We can all be ethologists. When I'm waiting at the bus station, I'm not buried in my iPhone. In fact, I don't even have an iPhone for that reason, because I'd rather be watching that little cluster of house sparrows over there to see what they're doing. And if you watch them and stop and look, you will become an ethologist, and you will see there's a lot more going on than you will be aware of if you don't really take any notice. Ethology is really the art of observation. And animals, as this picture shows, they are observers too, and they are sensors, and they're very interested in their worlds. So let's explore these worlds a little bit and start with perceptions. Perceptions are really important because they relate to how an animal perceives the world, how an animal senses their surroundings, how an animal takes in information. We look at these two rainbow lorikeets, an Australian small parrot species. We can think about their sensory world as really being quite similar to ours. They're very visual animals. They're diurnal like us, active in the daytime mainly. Obviously have very good color vision, and they have rich social lives. They do literally kiss each other to share their emotional attachment. They work together to raise their young. So their emotional and cognitive lives probably have some good close parallels to us. An animal like a fish, on the other hand, while it's a vertebrate, it has all of the sensory systems that we have, including smell and hearing. There's a lot more sounds and smelling going on below the surface of the water than we realize until we investigate it closely. But nonetheless, it's an animal with a very different sensory world. I love what D.H. Lawrence wrote in his poem, Fish. He described a fish's sensory world as a sluice of sensation along your sides. And I think that sort of captures our anthropomorphic way of thinking how a fish may sense the world. But it's important to realize there's other senses there as well. You may notice a row of specialized scales along the side. All bony fish have this, and it's called the lateral line. And these are cells that have a little hair inside, and they're particularly sensitive to changes in water pressure and water movement. And so that's an area where their experience may differ from ours. But nonetheless, they're sentient animals and they're vertebrates like us, and they share some parallels in their sensory world to us. Sea lions, back to mammals, probably a more similar sensory world to us, but they have a capacity that we don't have. With their sensitive whiskers on their nose, they're able to dive deep into the ocean below the level of where the light penetrates, and they can actually detect the presence of a fish who swam by as much as 5 minutes earlier from the turbulence trail left by the fish. And thereby they can pursue that trail and sometimes catch up to the fish and catch the fish. Pretty amazing sensory ability. Another amazing sensory animal is the bat, which is a close relative of us in the sense that this is a fellow mammal. You know, this is a warm-blooded animal, furry, bears live young, feeds them milk, and yet has this sort of, to us, alien way of orienting. They forage at night, and they fly 60 miles or more from their cave, sometimes 3 miles up in the sky, and they catch insects without really seeing them. And they use this echolocation system. And you can see from the enormous ears here that the processing of sound is very important. And if you look at a bat's brain, you find that a very large part of that brain is dedicated to the processing of sounds. And nonetheless, you can see this is a visual animal. Bats are not blind, contrary to the myth. An animal has a very good sense of smell, and I actually did my PhD work on this species, the Mexican free-tailed bat. And mothers are able to find their own pup, their single baby, in a cave with sometimes 5 million or more babies that are crowded in there in incredible densities. And they do this with a combination of spatial memory, vocal recognition. They recognize their voices just as we recognize someone's voice if we pick up the phone and they're familiar. And then finally, they have a smell signature that they can recognize. Finally, in regard to perceptions, just another example of a sensory ability that some animals have that we don't. Some birds can actually visualize the Earth's magnetic field, which is obviously very useful when you're migrating. So we have to be aware that our sense is really sort of a run-of-the-mill, and some other species have sensory abilities that really fall well outside of our sensory bandwidth. We tend to be anthropocentric or anthropomorphic, if you like, in our assessment of animals' sensory abilities. We can't really help this. We're anthropoid apes. We're humans. We're stuck in our human world. But one example of this is that for a long time it was thought that our closest relatives, chimpanzees, were rather poor at face recognition, until someone had the bright idea to actually test them on chimpanzee faces instead of human faces. We just assume our face is more distinctive. Of course, that's true for us, but we are humans who've evolved living among and looking at humans. Lo and behold, chimpanzees recognize chimp faces as well as we recognize human faces. They recognize upside-down chimp faces better than we can recognize upside-down faces. And if you look at their biology and think about their behavior, you can see why that might be the case. Animals tend to be good at things that are useful to them. What about emotions? And we're going to take a poll now. We're going to ask I want to ask you, actually, if you have ever lived with a cat or dog. So I'm going to try and turn on this poll. I think I click on the polls. I'm not sure that's doing anything, so I'm not sure how to do that. Anyway, if you see the opportunity to vote, by all means vote. Someone may be able to see what the responses are. I can't see it on my screen, and I can't seem to get it to open. So apologies if we can't summarize the results, but we need to move on. There were 2 questions, and I'll ask the second question of you. Second question is, do you think animals are emotional? And I can tell you that my audiences tend to be usually animal lovers, and so most people answer yes to both of those questions. They've lived with cats or dogs, often with other animals, and they think they're emotional. So I suspect the majority in the group, if not everybody, well, certainly to the second question, would say yes to that. Most people don't need convincing that animals are emotional. I'll give you one example from my experience when I can figure out how to get the slides to go on. Okay, here we go. One of my cats, following a visit to the vet, one of my cats, this one here, Micah, was so traumatized that he went on a hunger strike and spent 40 hours upstairs and wouldn't come down to eat. And curiously, he was not the one who'd actually been to the vet. It was his sister, Megan, who you see on the left here. And it really says something to the emotional sensitivity of an animal, that they can be so affected by the experience that they really haven't even had directly. He knew the smell of the vet. He knew that where Megan had been when she came home. Cats have great sense of smell, and he remembered that, and he knows that's a bad experience. Anyone who's lived with cats knows that they absolutely hate change. And so it's an anecdote that really does speak to the incredible emotional sensitivity that animals can have. But we don't have to rely just on anecdotes to appreciate animals' emotional capacities. But briefly, just here, I suppose this is sort of an anecdote, although I can tell you that scientific studies show that an animal such as this white-throated sparrow, who had bumped into my window on my deck, recovered fine, and I was able to release this bird a few minutes later. Nonetheless, being in the hand of a sort of what might be perceived as a predator is probably very stressful. And while just looking at this sparrow, you cannot tell that bird is stressed, or at least I cannot. If you were to take the heart rate and measure the blood pressure, and probably if you measured cortisol levels in the bloodstream, all of these physiological measures would indicate a very high state of stress, of elevated physiological activity that indicates an emotional feeling of stress. The body temperature probably would also rise, which is what is called emotional fever. But back to the scientific studies, other scientific studies, I want to give a couple of examples that really undermine a common old assumption that we have about animals, which is that they only live in the moment. A long-term Jane Goodall type study of baboons in southern Africa finds that mother baboons react to the loss of an infant in the same way physiologically, or at least in a parallel way, to the way women react to the loss of a child. Now, nobody in this group probably needs convincing that that's a tragic event for us to experience. We know it's a terrible loss. There's a prolonged grief. We may never fully recover from that loss. And also, the mother is not the only one to experience the loss. Close friends and relatives, other family members, etc., also will feel the pain of this loss. And it lasts. It's not just in the moment. It lasts for weeks, months, years, etc. Well, what about baboons? Well, by sampling blood hormones, which by the way can now be done by collecting fecal samples, which is much less invasive than catching the baboon and drawing blood, which was the old method, which is a very big confound because you stress the animal by doing that, and that's going to change hormone levels. But by doing this, by measuring these levels, the scientists found that mothers who'd lost an infant to predation or illness or what have you showed a very profound increase, significant increase in their glucocorticoid hormones, which are associated with pain of loss and emotional bereavement in humans. And the pattern was similar. In humans, it lasts about a month, and then it gradually subsides to baseline level. And the same time course was shown in these baboons by collecting these samples over the course of a few weeks or months. Similarly, the close friends in the baboon society, also of the one who'd lost the infant, also showed elevated levels, albeit to a lesser degree. So that's sort of the physiological parallel, which suggests bereavement. And the scientists themselves used this word in their published paper. The challenge, of course, is how do we know? I mean, we can't get inside the baboon, but we can certainly look at behavior and physiology and see if it parallels our own, because we don't question that we have these emotional capacities. And behaviorally, they don't send flowers or make soup for their loved ones as we would do. At least I'm not aware of any evidence for that. But don't be too surprised. But what they do is they expand their social networks. They seek therapy through grooming, as you see here. Grooming is a very important social behavior in primates, and it's stress relieving. We know a massage feels great, and it causes us to release endorphins and other sort of pleasure hormones into our bloodstream, and it relaxes us, and it's therapeutic. It's not just doesn't just feel good; it's actually good for our health. And so baboons are probably not thinking about that in that way any more than we often are, but they nonetheless have this behavior, which is consistent with the conclusion that they are trying to recover from an emotional pain. The second study I'll mention I can summarize in 4 words. Caged birds become pessimistic. And that word pessimistic is a sort of a word we haven't generally historically applied to non-humans. We know what pessimism is, and we know what optimism is, but it turns out that birds and other mammals have been shown to have this effect. If they're living in impoverished conditions, a tiny cage with no social company, they can't fly, they get boring food every day for a few days, just a few days like that, and they are much less likely to try a choice situation where there's an uncertain outcome. It may be good or bad, and they've undergone training to know that it could be good or bad, than are birds who've been housed in enriched big cages where they can fly. It's still captivity, but they can fly, they have social company, they have interesting food, a much more stimulating life. They're much more likely to try something with an uncertain outcome. And I described the experiment in more detail in my book, Second Nature. But just back to sort of a really, I think, a profound message from studies like the baboons with their bereavement and starlings who can feel pessimism or optimism, is that it really undermines the old assumption that animals live merely in the moment, that it's just life is like a series of snapshots as opposed to more like a film that plays out and rolls out with ongoing feelings and emotional tenors. Well, what about cognition? This is the processing of information mentally. Rats have what's called metacognition. I'm sure they're not the only mammal or even animal to have this. Probably birds, I'm sure, have this ability as well, and perhaps some other vertebrates. But metacognition is sort of an awareness of one's own knowledge. It's a rat will show confidence and will give the right answer by pushing the right lever if it's given 2 very different stimuli. Very easy. I want to push the lever and get it right because they get a treat, and they get no treat if they get it wrong. However, you start giving, if you train them to have option 3, which is to abort the question and go to the next question, they can do that, and the option is to, in this particular study, was to stick their nose into a little cone, and that essentially says, I don't know the answer, let's move on to the next one. And if you give them difficult discrimination tasks where the 2 tones or whatever the stimuli are so similar it's very hard to tell them apart, the rats will resort to sticking their nose in that cone. They won't push the lever. They would rather abort the question and go to the next one and get a very tiny treat than to get it wrong, risk getting it wrong, which would give them nothing. So that's essentially the experimental paradigm, the method used to demonstrate what's called metacognition, or awareness of one's own knowledge in an animal. And rats pass this, and other species have done as well. Here's another small rodent, a meadow vole, very common across North America, mostly not seen. They live sort of under the grass, but they're very numerous. And there's probably 10,000 of them within a mile of wherever you're sitting. The chances are, if you have any natural habitats near you, they're going to be there. So they're very successful. They have episodic memory. An interesting study shows that a male meadow vole, and I'm sure females can do this as well, can remember the what, the when, and the where of a past event. Similarly, scrub jays, a bird species, obviously, they are caching species. They bury food like squirrels do, and they come back later to get it. So you would expect that they would have a very fine-tuned spatial memory. Otherwise, they're wasting their time burying food if they can't find it again. And it's quite important to be able to find it if you have to go through those cold winter months when there's not much fresh food around to be able to relocate where you buried it. So birds who had poor memories, their genes for lousy memory wouldn't likely to be passed on through the generations, whereas birds with good memories would have a selective advantage, hence natural selection for a good memory. But captive studies show that these birds remember not only where they buried something, they remembered what it was, they remembered and they know how much time has elapsed. And this study was done by giving them foods that have different rates of decay. So peanuts they have a much longer shelf life than do waxworms, which become rotten and unpalatable and unpleasant to eat after about 5 days. And the birds, if they buried waxworms on one side of an arena, they would avoid that side if it had been more than 5 days since they buried it. So they're keeping track of time, and the experiments were carefully designed to make sure that they weren't just simply smelling that the worms were foul-smelling. They replaced them with fresh ones, and still the birds would ignore them and go to the peanuts because too much time had elapsed. So there's ways to test these things. Science used to be agnostic on questions about how you probe and how you question animals' cognitive or emotional capacities. And now science is no longer in that sort of agnostic phase, and they are asking questions and coming up with innovative studies to test these things. Well, we can say, well, that's cool, but I have metacognition as well. I know what I know and what I don't know, and I also have episodic memory. Oh, by the way, I must very briefly go back and just add the word who to the what, where, and when, because scrub jays also know when they're being watched by another bird, and they will, if they've been experienced the stealing of their food, or if they've stolen themselves, they'll go back and move it later so that they'll avoid having their caches taken by other birds. So it takes a thief to know one in scrub jay society. But we can say, well, that's cool, but I have these capacities as well. What about an intelligence skill in which an animal far exceeds ourselves? That happens, and it probably happens a lot. In fact, I would say that a scrub jay's spatial memory is much better than mine. I often can't find the remote or my watch in the house. That's just one item, whereas these birds will vary more than 30,000 items over the warmer months and can probably remember where most of those were. So I'm going to give you a visual test here, which is a test given to captive chimpanzees, which they do very well at. It's a spatial memory, a very short-term spatial memory test. You're going to see the numbers 1 to 9 pop up in a random array on the screen, and then they're going to be replaced by white rectangles. Your task would be, if you were actually doing the actual test, would be to point to the rectangles in the order of the numbers 1 through 9. And if you get them all right, you get a treat. If you get them wrong at some point, you get a buzzer, and it goes to the next trial with no treat. So the chimpanzees are trained. They learn the numbers 1 to 9. They know the order, and then they're given this test. The catch is you're only going to get 1 second, so be ready. Here you go. As you can see, it's a pretty tough task, and most humans will get to maybe 3 or 4 if they get 1 second, if they're having a good day. Chimpanzees like a Yumu here will get it right 100% of the time, pretty much never get it wrong if they have a whole second. If they have 1/5 of a second, which is about that much time, they still get it right about 90% of the time. It's really an astonishing ability. We do have a video. Do we want to try the video? I'm not sure. We're a little nervous about that, but we can try it. We're going to see if we can show you a video here of this. And the video you'll see, this is actually a screenshot from the video. This is a Yumu, who is one of the better chimps at doing this. He's about 5 years old here. And chimps, when they're really young, are especially good at performing this task. Well, if we go to the bottom, let's see if we can get it there. If you go to, did she? Why don't you try cat pleasure? See what happens. If you just, because I think she already has it set up. I don't think you need to paste. I think if you just go to cat pleasure, and then we can click on this one. So let's see. I hope you'll be able to see this. That's the wrong one. Here we are. So let's roll this. If you can see the video, you'll see this chimp points to a circle on the screen to say, okay, I'm ready, and then points to the numbers in order very quickly. No ego here. There's no pride in this. The chimp just does it because they want the treat, and it's probably entertaining for them. They don't do this all day long. They do it just for maybe 20 minutes a day, part of their daily activities. These are not in a vivisection lab. They're in a behavioral setup in Japan. Okay, so can we go back to the, and the chimp did just get it wrong there very briefly. Great. And let me just go to the presentation mode. Great, thank you. Okay, so there you have that, and we'll hopefully show one more video in a few minutes of another thing. I want to mention fish. Fish have been really dismissed as automatons, sort of Cartesian creatures who don't really have any capacities to feel or think. That's all going by the wayside now. Scientific studies are showing that fishes, like their other fellow vertebrates, actually have very rich sensory cognitive lives. Here's a fish that has an amazing memory ability. These fish, this is a frillfin goby. They live on shore areas and in tidal zones, and so when the tide goes out, they end up in these little tide pools, and they have the remarkable ability to be able to leap from tide pool to tide pool. Well, how can they do this? Well, a scientist way back in the early 70s did a series of experiments, captive, that showed that these fish actually memorize the topography of the tide pools at high tide while they're swimming over those depressions in the rocks. And then once they have that memory, which is sort of an aerial or radial memory, they're able to apply that to a completely different dimension when they're stuck in these tide pools. So if the fish is in pool B here on the lower right, and pool B is drying up, or some heron lands there and might try to catch the fish, this goby is able to avoid making a leap of faith and can actually make an accurate leap into pool C and then into the largest, deepest pool at the top left. So it's a very useful adaptation in this particular habitat type, and it involves a remarkable bit of mental processing of spatial information. What about awareness? Studies of elephants show that elephants who tend to need to walk long distances, they're highly social animals, matriarchal groups, these are probably all females here, except for the very young. They keep mental tabs on other elephants. How do we know this? Well, one way to test it was to dig up fresh urine from an elephant and put it back in the sand. And this is an elephant who was walking ahead of this group. So picture an elephant further on the right off your computer screen, perhaps a quarter mile ahead. When the elephants arrived and they smelled this, and by the way, elephants like mice and some other mammals leave urine. Urine acts as sort of a business card, a sort of information card. Sometimes it gives off more information that the animal may want to give off, but nonetheless it's information that's useful, and they can identify each other from that sort of urine signature, if you like. By the way, don't try this at home. It's not very popular in human society. But elephants, it's great. It works for them. And these elephants, if they find this urine from an elephant walking ahead, they would check it out and then move on. But if the scientists take some fresh urine from another elephant in the group who's walking, say, a quarter mile behind, so sort of to the left of your monitor, and then they quickly and surreptitiously trundle it up ahead and deposit that on the ground, the elephants, on arriving at that fresh urine, will spend a lot more time. They twist their trunks. They look surprised. And indeed, it doesn't fit expectation to find fresh urine from an elephant who you know is walking behind you. And so that's sort of a clever, if devious way to sort of test the sort of mental awareness. And it's thought that elephants, and a given elephant is probably keeping mental tabs on 50 or more, or 30 or more, although it could be 50 or more other elephants at any one time. It's a very useful skill when you live in a social group, you have other family groups you're familiar with in the area, and you move to different places, to fruiting trees and to water holes and such like that. It's a way of knowing who's who and where, and they also share information by seismic communication, by making very deep rumbles in the ground, which transfer over long distances. Until 2008, only 3 groups of animals, elephants, dolphins, and great apes, had passed the so-called mirror self-recognition test, which is thought to be sort of the holy grail test of self-awareness, where you put a surreptitious mark on an animal, such as the yellow dot here, and then you put the animal in front of the mirror. If the animal makes a threat display or looks behind the mirror, then it suggests the animal may not recognize that he or she is seeing him or herself in the mirror. But if the animal tries to remove the dot, it suggests that the animal recognizes that the reflection is themselves. And then magpies here pass the test. So we have at least one bird with this ability. It's important to add, though, that failing this test doesn't necessarily indicate the lack of self-recognition. It's a stringent test, and Some animals may just not be, have a sort of a clear idea of what a mirror is and what it does. So I think it's important to be a bit cautious about that. But these birds would try to remove that yellow dot, and if it was a black dot, they wouldn't try to remove it. That was the control. It was camouflage. They couldn't see it, and apparently couldn't feel it there either. Communication is a useful window into the inner lives of animals. I'll give a couple of examples here. Prairie dogs have the misfortune of having a lot of natural enemies, including aerial predators and coyotes and domestic dogs and humans with guns. And lo and behold, over the course of evolution, they've developed a very sophisticated alarm signaling system where they have calls to identify, discrete calls that identify a snake or a coyote or a domestic dog or a large hawk or a really big eagle or something else, or a ferret. But not only that, meticulous studies show that they also modify these calls. They will add color. If the person is wearing a yellow shirt when they come in, they will modify the call to indicate that. They don't say the word yellow, of course, but they make a modifier to the call that denotes the color yellow. Why they do that, it's not at all clear. Why they modify the call to indicate that this is the guy who has the shotgun, that makes more sense because obviously that's a great danger to prairie dogs. So the people studying them suggest that they have a vocabulary of over 100 words, and there's the syntax as well. They will order things in the right order, and many animals will do that, including birds. Speaking of birds, chickens have 30 or more vocalizations that are discrete, and I'll describe one of these, a call made by roosters. It's sort of a come hither call or a food solicitation call, sort of a cluck, cluck, cluck sound. And roosters will only make this if there's a hen nearby, and they do this specifically to call a hen over if they find a little tasty morsel, such as a cricket or a grasshopper in the ground. These are omnivorous birds, and they'll sometimes eat it themselves, but they might want to curry some favor with a hen, so they'll make this call, and she comes running, and he will try and point it out, and if she finds it and eats it, well, if you're cynical enough, you'll know he's probably buying some credit, perhaps for some future reward, sort of a trade-off. Not then, probably days or maybe even a week or more later, so it involves individual recognition, memory, and keeping mental tabs on others, sort of keeping accounts. But it gets a little more Machiavellian than that. Sometimes a rooster will make this call when he's found nothing. It's a deception, and studies, meticulous observational studies, show that they won't do this if the hen is too close, presumably because she could detect the deception. She comes running, he does the usual thing, and he may be able to get away with it and get some credit on the cheap because the cricket may have crawled away or the grasshopper jumped. So it is a way that they can get some credit, perhaps without any personal cost to themselves. Hens are just as perceptive, though, as roosters, and a rooster who is an inveterate cheater will probably soon be shunned by hens. And there's a really important moral or virtuous message in there, and that is that, well, just with respect to deception itself, while it's quite widespread in animals, it's not common, because if we all lied all the time, we would soon learn to ignore whatever anyone said, like the famous never cry wolf fable. It speaks to the fact that most of us give honest signals most of the time, and deceivers use that to take advantage on occasion. I mentioned pleasure near the beginning of my talk. I want to just go through a very brief tour of some of the sources of animal pleasure. But first, about this neglect of pleasure. I know of at least 23 English language journals that have the word pain in the title of the journal. So the American Journal of Pain, Pain Management, Pain, the European Journal of Pain, etc. I only know of one obscure journal called the Journal of Happiness Studies that even begins to get into the realms of pleasure, and that's a journal that's primarily focused on human happiness, and it's a journal that has been defunct much of the time. I think it's currently maybe in publication again, but it's quite obscure. So we really have neglected this very important positive side of our lives. We don't have to be too creative to recognize that animals can feel pain. Plants, for instance, have been taking advantage of this for a long time. It behooves a plant to keep their leaves, and so they discourage too much foraging by producing sometimes painful structures like this. We can also recognize pleasure, though, in an animal. And back to the pain, it's quite easy to recognize pain. Perhaps pleasure is often more subtle, although I would say a little bit not so subtle here with Clementine, this runty piglet being fed a bottle of milk. Once again, plants can illustrate the importance of pleasure in nature. Fruit are a beautiful illustration of a grand co-evolutionary bargain struck between plants and animals, because fruit, just like seeds that blow in the wind or that stick to our clothes or an animal's fur and get dropped off somewhere else later, it's a way to disperse seeds, to move the seeds away from the parent plant where they're not competing with the parent for light, nutrition, and water. And fruit do it by having a big flag, a lovely bright color and a nice smell. The animal comes and grabs it and maybe carries it off or eats it then and deposits it down later with a very convenient package of fertilizer. It's a wonderful arrangement built on all sort of built around pleasure, the sensory pleasures of taste and smell and sight. I mentioned grooming earlier. 1/5 of their waking time, some primate species will spend grooming each other. It's not just a leisure activity, although you could see it that way, but it's also a very important social glue to keep everybody happy. And also studies show, sadly, that if an animal goes without this kind of treatment, they will be stunted emotionally and behaviorally, and they will not be normal. Their brains probably will be smaller, and they will just not have a happy life. It's known in humans as well. Some animals, such as this goat here, have the convenience of having a built-in back scratcher, and they will use that. And if you go to an animal sanctuary, as I have done, and my daughter here many years ago, and you rub a friendly sheep's back, don't be too surprised if they scrape your boot to ask for more, or if they come and bump up against you. They love it, and they like more of it. We have another video here, and Joan is going to help me to just get this online, so you can see an example of the cat you met earlier, Megan, being brushed, and she absolutely so loves to be brushed. If you have a cat and you have brush them regularly. They really love it. And so we can go to this one here. I'll just click on this and then go to the cat pleasure. I put this on YouTube a couple of years ago, and you'll see I'm going to thump the brush on the floor, and she's going to come running in to get brushed. So the first indication that it's pleasurable is that the animal moves towards the stimulus. It doesn't take much creativity to recognize that. And you'll see she flops around on both sides. And she'll often, I'm walking along and she'll run in front of me and flop down. It's sort of a very clear invitation to be brushed. And she likes it on the back, she likes it on the neck, and also on the belly. And then if I thump the brush ahead of her, as I do here, right now, she'll crawl up to it. Got that nice slippery fur which moves very nicely along the carpet. Okay, we can go back to the thing. Thanks. Okay, so there's some pretty arresting examples of pleasure in nature. And here's another one. This is a wild situation. Warthogs in parts of Africa will flop down in an area where they know there's a colony of banded mongooses, and the mongooses will come and swarm over them. And basically, it's a mutualism. It's food for spa treatment. The mongooses get parasites and bits of salt and what have you off the warthog's body surface, and the warthog gets this delightful spa treatment, this massage. And you can probably recognize, even from this still photo, that the warthog is absolutely loving this. We see the same phenomenon in fish, in coral reefs, among fish who will literally line up to wait their turn to be serviced by cleaner fish. You'll see there's actually a pair of these cleaner wrasses here. There's one just above the eye of the matte pufferfish, who's sort of the client receiving the cleaning service, the spa treatment, probably feels good. I doubt very much whether this pufferfish is thinking, oh, it's important I get these parasites off and that my sloughing skin be taken off and then I get this algae off my skin. They probably line up and wait their turn because they know these are good clients. They've worked with them before, and it feels great to have them pluck over and remove those little mites from my gills and what have you. And like a good business relationship, you don't eat your client, your business partner, and these cleaners will swim right through the mouth and in through the gills of these client fish. Other fish are observing these cleaning performances, and they will actually form a long-term image score, and they will be more or less inclined to go and work with those cleaner fishes depending on the level of performance they give. So it's pretty complex. Once again, you have, like the chickens, the rooster call, you have deception. Sometimes fishes will actually mimic the cleaners and bite off more than they should chew, and that's probably partly why you have this monitoring behavior, because some are better cleaners than others. I don't like to talk about pleasure without mentioning sex. I'm going to mention it very briefly. We often think of sex as being just simply passionless and rather perfunctory in animals if it's broached at all in a nature documentary. But there's a book out there called Biological Exuberance, and it's a 750-page book which summarizes some of the manifestly non-procreative sexual behavior in mammals and birds, and there are many, many examples of inappropriate penetration of body parts, same-sex pairings, self-stimulation, and other examples like that. So I recommend that book if you want to have a survey of some of the salacious activities that animals engage in that are not just about making babies. Virtue is an exciting, relatively new frontier in the study of animal behavior. If you live socially especially, it behooves you to get along. It behooves you to be considerate of others. And we see example after example of this in nature. Animals keep tabs, they know who's who, and they show deference, and they show friendliness, and they do good deeds. And there's various good theories to help explain that, including kin selection, reciprocal altruism, group selection. You know, being good to others pays off. And so we find things like empathy in mice, where if the mouse in the middle here is subjected to a painful stimulus, the mouse on the right, if that mouse can observe the mouse in the middle writhing in pain, and they will literally writhe in pain. I'm glad I was not a mouse in this experiment. It's not one I would recommend or would have approved, but it was done. And I believe in using the information available to try and improve the animal's lot. Well, if that mouse on the right can see this mouse writhing, the mouse on the right will be much more sensitive to pain herself. And I say herself because only females show this response, and only if they know the mouse in the middle, only if it's a familiar mouse, be it a sibling or a former cage mate. So it's a nuanced response, but it's an empathic one. Animals also show patience, even though they may be competing for the same resource. A friend of mine, photographer French of Unreal in South Africa, it was a very hot day, over 100 degrees in the Kalahari Desert, and she put out a mug of water, and this mixed flock of red-headed weavers and red-headed finches and sociable weavers arrived, and they all essentially took their turn to get their share of some water before flying off as a group. Yes, there are costs to living in a group. You have to compete for the same resources, but there are also benefits, such as having more eyes and ears to check out for danger. There's a thing called the information center hypothesis, where older, more experienced individuals may have knowledge about where a food source may be at a certain time, and the others can all benefit from that. This is a little bit like back to the elephants, who rely on the older individuals, the matriarchs, to have the knowledge to help to pass that information on to younger generations. And so we see a lot of examples of deference and giving and caring and being nice to others in nature. It isn't all about red in tooth and claw, as sort of the old myths about nature tend to be. There's a lot more leisure time and pleasure in nature than scientists will often give you the impression. One last example that relates to virtue is sort of a fairness awareness, or inequity aversion, to use the jargon that scientists will use. A couple of dogs, these are dogs who, this is a study done in Hungary, and these dogs know Hungarian. And if you put a couple of dogs in, and they did this with a bunch of dogs, several dozen, put them next to each other, and they offer them a hand to shake, alternating, they're happy to do that 30 times or more, whether you give them both treats or if you give them no treats. Dogs are very interactive. They like the engagement. They like the social interaction. It's rewarding in itself. But if, as in this case here, you are only rewarding one dog, and here you can guess which dog it is. It's the one on the right who's been getting a treat each time he or she offers the paw to shake. The one on the left has not. And after only 10 or 12 trials, the dog who's not getting a treat will do what this dog here on the left is doing. It will refuse to offer the paw and to engage in any further shaking activity. How is the dog feeling? What kind of emotion is going on here? That's more challenging. It could be indignance. It could be frustration. It's not fatigue, because they will continue to do it for 30 or more trials if there's no treats for either of them. So it's a very interesting response that indicates a negative affect in response to unfair treatment or unequal distribution of rewards. Oh, I do have this one other last example. A couple of very recent studies published earlier this year involving chimps, which I think involve both two types of sort of what you could say are virtuous behavior. No question about the first one. A study of wild populations, I think this was in New Guinea, not Guinea, sorry, Guinea in Africa, found that documented 18 cases of adoption of orphaned infants. A chimp who died in a snare or something else. Tragically, the infant is left parentless. And these are generally, it's females who raise the young. And you look at the Jane Goodall studies, it's the mothers. It's very much the mothers do all the work. Well, curiously, 9 of the 18 adoptions that were observed in this wild population involved males. adopting infants and raising them and spending months, years to bring them to maturity so they could be independent. Quite remarkable findings. It sort of flies in the face of old assumptions about chimp behavior. And then the other study was documented of disarming snares, wire snares, which are commonly put. Unfortunately, poaching is rampant in a lot of these wild areas, and these chimps obviously have learned and know that these snares are terrible things, and they recognize them, they find them, they seek them out, and they dismantle them if they can. They're not always successful, but interestingly, snaring rates are much, much lower in these areas, significantly lower. So it appears to be working, and I just read last week of studies of gorillas also doing this. So gorillas are also beginning to dismantle snares. This is encouraging, obviously. Nevertheless, we have a lot of prejudice about animals, and I'm sort of in the closing section of my presentation now, and I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the bigger picture, the take-home messages, the sort of the moral issues, the ethical questions that arise when we consider that other animals are sentient like us. We tend to have a rather dim view of animals that we're preparing to eat, and turkeys are an example. These 8 turkeys here, this is their first time outdoors. This was the day that they had arrived at Farm Sanctuary, a sanctuary for rescued farmed animals in New York State, and they'd never had a chance to look at the sky. And keeping an eye on the sky is very important for a ground bird because there are potential predators up there, just as for prairie dogs. And Susie Costin, who looks after the animals at the sanctuary, when she saw them doing this, they were all sort of suddenly taking a look up at the sky. She wondered what was up there, and she looked and couldn't see anything. And they kept, they seemed to be following something, and she looked again, and there was a tiny little jet way up in the sky. So although they'd never seen that before, and of course it behooves them to be wary of anything new, it shows just how acute their observational skills are. Another animal who we eat or we take their fur, their wool, and we tend to exploit is the sheep. And studies show that there's a lot more going on between the eyes of a sheep than we tend to think with our old myths about them being sort of dim-witted following animals. And studies show that a sheep will recognize 50 of her flock mates 2 years after she last saw them, just from a series of still photographs, be it straight on as you see here or in profile. Sheep also will prefer to go through a door to get food that has a photo of a just fed sheep and presumably contented feeling than a photo of a very hungry sheep. The faces look much the same as ours, as to us. The two faces look much the same to us, but the sheep are able to distinguish the emotional tenor of that animal just from the expression on the face. And back to fish, just a few things about fish that we've really missed the boat on fish. There's so much more going on in a fish's body and mind than we've given them credit for. This is obviously not a fish, but this is a warbler who has the remarkable ability to recognize the calls of their territory neighbors even after they've migrated thousands of miles from one season to the next. They come back, they land in the same little area of the forest they were in last year, and they know their territory calls. If it's Joe on one end and Steve on the other, they are comfortable because they know their familiar territory neighbors. If you play Steve's call where Joe normally is, that bird freaks out. And so does this fish, a damselfish, will do the same thing. They're content, they're okay with hearing the sounds of the familiar territory neighbors, but if you move one to another location, they will be very unhappy with that and become quite agitated. So here's an example of something that we just assume it's a sort of a cognitive, a remarkable memory skill in a bird, but when we think of a fish, we sort of think of, oh, it must be just a sort of some kind of instinctive mechanical thing. There's no thinking going on. We need to be much more open to the fact that these animals have actually thoughts and memories. They're every bit as sophisticated as their terrestrial kin. I mentioned cleaning stations already, and once again you see this phenomenon back to sort of the warthog and the mongooses where a hippo enjoys this spa treatment from fish, and the fishes are very much involved in this, and different species will come, and the hippo splays their toes and spreads their legs and opens the mouth, and the fishes will swim in there and pluck away at bits of plaque and vegetation and sloughing skin and what have you. The fish get food and the hippos get spa treatment, and they will sometimes drift off into a blissful nap. So enjoyable does this appear to be for them. Just a word about invertebrates. You know, people often ask me, where do we draw the line on sentience, the capacity to feel? I think we should draw it in pencil because new information is continually coming forward that enlightens us and gives us pause for thought. You know, is there any experience of pleasure in these two land snails engaging in copulation? We shouldn't assume that there's not. They have a sensory system. They have a nervous system. So this word sentience, which I've mentioned a couple of times, the capacity to feel, I think it's really the most important word in our language with regards to ethics and morals. In fact, I like to think of it as the bedrock of ethics, the foundation of moral systems, the foundation of ideas of good and bad, and right and wrong, and consideration for others, is that others have lives that matter. And the reason those lives matter is that they're sentient. They have feelings, they have experiences, they have a life, they have days that can go well or poorly. And here's a common assumption we make, and the famous biologist Richard Dawkins is putting the lie to this comment, this assumption that just because we have a bigger brain, it doesn't mean that we feel pain any more acutely than a mouse does or another animal. And that's a really sobering but a very important message to be aware of. Unfortunately, our history with animals has generally been, as is sort of literally and symbolically shown in this photo, us being on top. We're dominant, regardless of how huge and powerful the animal is. Because of our brains and our hands, our capacity to manipulate things, we've been able to lord it over them. And sadly, we generally have. And the big ponderous chain on this elephant is sort of symbolic of that kind of domination that we've had. So summing up then, animals are sensory. They're perceptive. They're interested in their world. They take it in. They take in information that we take in, and sometimes information that we don't. We're not party to. They have private lives and pleasurable moments. They're individuals. I love what philosopher Tom Reagan said. They don't just have a biology. They have a biography. And we need to put ourselves in their place. We need to show empathy. We may not know what it's like to be a little ringneck snake here, but that's an animal with a full sensory system, and we need to give them consideration as well. And I love what Anne Frank said in that we don't need to wait a single moment to do the right thing to make the world better for animals. You can write letters, you can shop compassionately, be it at the supermarket or the drugstore. Right now, every day, we can do that, and that's very empowering to know that we can make a difference for animals through our own activities every day. And there really is no limit to what one individual can achieve for animals. The woman in this slide is Jill Robinson, a British national, and when she discovered these horrendous crush cages in which Asian bears were kept for years, sometimes decades, for having bile drained out of their gallbladders for Chinese medicine, she founded Animals Asia Foundation, and today more than 200 of these bears have been rescued from these terrible conditions, and the bear you see in this picture is the same bear you see in this final picture. This is Jasper, and he's become one of the ambassadors for these Asian bears as efforts begin to accelerate in releasing these bears from this archaic and cruel practice. And it really speaks to the resilience of animals, that an animal who had the horrendous past this bear had can be able to recover and become a personality that people love to see. So we can all make a difference, and I think one last point I want to make is that a world that's better for animals is a world that's better for humans as well. We, of course, are biologically animals. We share the world with them. What's good for them is ultimately good for us. Thanks for attending today.
Thanks very much to Dr. Jonathan Baltham for kicking off our webinar series. I hope that everyone listening found it as exciting and as informative as I did. To get more information about the offerings at Humane Society University, please go to www.humanesocietyuniversity.org and get more information. If you need to contact Dr. Baltham, his email is on the screen here, jbaltham@humanesocietyuniversity.org. Thank you all for attending. We look forward to having you back for our next one.